to transition and look towards vegetables now. So we had quite a few questions on vegetables. I know fall gardening is becoming, more and more popular. So had some questions kind of in that kind of area. If you have things that are coming to mind now, just go ahead and pop them in that question answer box, just like we did for the fruit category, and we will just kind of get things rolling. And of course, we have all of our panelists here to pull from. And Natalie and Melody specifically said that they would help with answering questions in this today. But if you have information, of course, we want you to join in on that. Okay, so looking at a few other questions we have here. So, and I'm afraid we may have missed the window, but I'm gonna let our veggie experts kind of guide the conversation on this. But I had several questions on growing fall vegetables. When is it too late to get things like broccoli and spinach started? And do they still have time to get some subsequent, crops in the ground as far as greens are concerned? So I'll let y'all kind of take that conversation in the direction that you.
Crops that are going to be, producing floral structures, like broccoli and things like that. We're definitely past the window for those. Now, if you have maturing crops in the ground, you can still get good yield, maybe some protective structures. This could be a great time to consider after we get past the 80 degrees. I mean, some season extension techniques. I mean, I have definitely had, Brussels sprouts for New Year's kind of situation. So you definitely have some opportunity to extend productivity and support growth from the plants that you have in the ground. On the leafy crop question, I mean, even most of our suggestions will be try to get those seeded by the early part of October. So if you have some like small spinach or something in the ground, then you could protect it, get potentially good February, March types of production out of that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you would probably be looking at more spring productivity than getting enough growth and productivity in the fall. What would you say, Melody, Lucas?
Yep, couldn't agree more. I think it might be a little bit late. And if you're planting greens and stuff, the first week of October, I guess we've got some other questions about covering them up a little bit with some fabrics and things like that. Now, I planted some broccoli the first week of October that someone gave me. A nursery was getting rid of it, and I'm going to try it. Now, like Natalie talked about the Brussels sprouts, I picked broccoli on the first day of January because it was such a mild winter. It's going to be hit or miss. It's a little bit of a gamble planting stuff this late, but I think she hit the nail on the head.
And so what we really want to plant right now is cover crops, right, Melody?
Woo! Oh, yes. Yes. We still have time to be sowing some seeds. Some are going to be a little slower than others, but again, kind of like what Natalie was talking about, some of the greens and the cold crops, you might not see a flush of growth like we would see if we sowed those in mid-September, but actually covering any fallow ground is going to be better than nothing. So make sure that you get something on there. I think there was a question in there too about in containers or raised beds about sowing cover crops. You can do that. I just wouldn't use a rice. Sure. So it can be hard to kind of turn those in. Go ahead.
And we'll I'll find the link and put it in the chat box for everybody. But there is a cool publication that some of my colleagues here have done about planting dates and cover crops. Now it is East Tennessee, but they've compared September and November planting dates. And as a general statement, you'll still get good, reasonable soil coverage, but later planting will really reduce spring biomass. Which, if you absolutely want maximum organic matter, that could be a detraction. But if you, don't want to fight huge amounts of dry plant material in the spring and give it time to decompose and till in, like it could actually be an asset.
All right. Good combos. So here's another one that's kind of going back to that vein of when we were talking about our greens. We had a question about they planted like a community garden. They planted some turnip and collard greens. It says about a month ago, and I looked at the date that that question was submitted. That was turned in like the second week in October. So they had planted them in like mid-September. They came up, they did great, but then they just kind of quit growing. So any advice on what might have kind of stunted that growth, or what they need to do to get those to go ahead and do their thing?
Well, I'll throw out a couple of ideas, and then you guys can see if you agree. So first, we have had a dry, for the most part, fall. So moisture would be one thing that I would think of. Another idea that I would toss out there is that oftentimes we may not add very much additional fertilizer for our second crop coming in, say if that was coming out of a warm season type of crop, and yeah, you're taking good care of your tomatoes or peppers or whatever that was. Our leafy crops are actually fairly high nitrogen needing crops. And so it could have been, they used up the readily reserved fertilizer that was in nutrients that were in that soil, and they got hungry after a month or so of growth.
That was really what I was thinking. And depending on where you were, or if you had irrigation, certainly water could have been a restricting factor. But in my head, I was thinking, probably nutrition, because folks just forget, you're so hyper focused on fertilizing and getting your warm season crops to do well, that sometimes once we get into that fall season, that kind of falls off the radar. So,
but
and on those, go
ahead,
I was
Lucas.
going to say though, Natalie, what you were talking about, and Celeste, on that nutrition, if you don't have enough water to put that nutrition into solution, to make that smoothie for that plant to drink, it's not going to uptake that nutrient.
That's an excellent point. Go ahead, Lucas.
And on those greens, sometimes we just sow them way too thick. So if you are just getting a half a pound of, we'll say, collard or turnip greens, and you just broadcast them and they're so thick they don't really have room to grow, you may need to go in there and yank out some of those so they can get room. Collards, we want those leaves that get about this big. And if they don't have the room to get that big, then that's why they're just probably stunted right there. And I have that same problem too. My daughters help me. They go out and broadcast turnip green seeds. So you should see my garden right now of the clusters of just turnip greens where she just stood and threw seeds over and over again. Reach in there and pull some out if they're too thick.
Good point. Good point. That was so cute. I saw you put a thing on Facebook when y'all were out there sowing those seeds, Lucas. She was adorable.
Young Coleman farmers, they really are some of the best parts of my Facebook feeds.
Free labor.
All right. Anything
got
else?
A question about lettuce. Did I miss that?
I do not see a question.
There was a question in the chat box that said, what is the temperature at which lettuce is killed? And so this is a challenging question to answer with precision, right? Because it can depend on the maturity stage of the lettuce, and it depends upon the amount of how much cool temperature you'd had leading up to that, right? And it's especially challenging for us in our variable fall conditions, because we might have that first, mid to low 20s night when it had been 80 degrees the day before. And so that's going to impact how much resilience we'll have. The ballpark number, like I would say, you may see some damage between, in the mid 20s. If you have had conditions that have slowly gotten that plant, more acclimated, you may be able to get lower than that. But we kind of put lettuce in our, middle sensitivity category. It's not going to be as tough as kale or spinach. So, I start thinking about covering it up, anytime that we're going to get, into the mid 20s.
And I like that you mentioned covering it up, and Seth had mentioned some season extension things earlier in the session. Let's tell everybody what we mean when we say cover them up. You don't mean go out there necessarily and put a bed sheet on them. We're looking for some specific products that can help us with season extension. So what are some options that folks have out there to create some low tunnels, right? Or some small structures to get those covered up with?
Yeah. I love season extensions. So we kind of have two broad categories. One of them being what would be a floating row cover, which looks like it's actually a plastic material that is woven of sorts. And so it is permeable to air. A lot of times people will use it as a floating row cover right along the tops of plants. That is simple to apply, easy, right? No additional materials, but you can get some temperature damage as it's sitting on top of plant material. So I often like to use tunnels, whether it be a small PVC pipe or, a heavy gauge wire. Of course, you can buy them or you can make them, and keep my floating row cover, make it into a low tunnel. You can also use polyethylene plastic that is generally a pre-manufactured type of tunnel, and it has slits in it. And you can install that and make your own low tunnel.
Y'all, I wish I had brought it with me. I just ordered some new floating row cover. I could have had it here to show on video for those who are visiting with us live today. But yeah, my old stuff got ratty. I decided to invest in the future of gardening.
There's a lot of different weights. So in the springtime, you may use something that's very light just to exclude pests. In the fall, heading into the winter, you can have a little bit heavier cover to get a little bit more temperature gain, but it will reduce the light. So it's always a balancing act.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think that kind of rounds out our section there on veggies. Thanks for those who put questions in the chat and submitted things to the online portal, right? We couldn't make this happen if y'all weren't turning in those questions.